Hey, hello, what's up everyone? In this video I'm going to teach you Rahu in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart in Vedic astrology. So, before beginning, if you are not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe to my channel, hit the bell icon and click the like button. And if you have any doubt after watching this video, please to mention it in my below comment section, okay? And yes, please to like and follow my Facebook community page Parikshith Astrology, where you can also post some astrological stuff and gain knowledge. So, let's begin. So, mainly, what do you mean by Navamsa chart or the D9 chart? See, Navamsa chart or the D9 chart is the second most important chart of your birth chart. It mainly gets activated after your second half of your life or after your married life. So, second half of your life means that is after 33 years or 36 years of your age. Now, it is mainly seen for your stages of your planet. It is also seen for your married life, your relationship between you and your spouse, or your marital life. Now, coming to the married life. See, every individual divisional chart, including the main birth chart, has its own Karaka planet or the significator planet, right? Now, suppose in the birth chart, Sun is the Karaka planet or the significator planet, right? Likewise, in your Navamsa chart or in the D9 chart, Venus is the Karaka planet or the significator planet. So, Venus should be placed in an exalted sign, Multrikon sign, own sign, or in a friendly sign. That shows that your married life will be very good. Now, coming to the 7th house of the D9 chart or the Navamsa chart. Now, what does 7th house of the D9 chart or Navamsa chart represents? See, 7th house of the D9 chart or Navamsa chart represents after your married life, how will be your relationship between you and your spouse. It also shows that how will be your married life. It also represents your spouse personality or characteristics. It also shows that whether you are willing to compromise in your marriage or not can be seen to the 7th house of the D9 chart or Navamsa chart. It also shows that your unity between you and your spouse. It also shows that long distance travel after married life. So these are all the things can be seen through the 7th house of the D9 chart or Navamsa chart. Now, what happens when Rahu is sitting in the 7th house of the D9 chart or Navamsa chart? Now, what does planet Rahu represents? Planet Rahu represents foreign lands, foreign things, foreigner. It also represents foreign currency. It also represents fame. It also represents illusory thinking. It also represents obsession to particular things. So mainly when Rahu is sitting in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart, it shows that after your married life, you might be having some relationship problems with you and your spouse. And it also shows that there might be breakup also after your married life or even before married life also. And it also shows that you might get cheated by your spouse or you might cheat your spouse. And it also shows that during marriage you might be having some problems where you need to face that problems. So these are all things can be seen through when Rahu is sitting in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart. And one thing you need to note down here is you need to check the dispositor of Rahu, where it is placed. If it is placed very well, then that shows that surely you need not to worry about the married life. And you need to check if Jupiter is aspecting that Rahu or 7th house. So if Jupiter is aspecting that 7th house or Rahu, that shows that surely your married life will be protected up to some great extent. Now, what happens when Rahu is conjected with different planets like benefic planets and malefic planets? Now coming to the benefic planets. Now what happens when Rahu is conjected with benefic planets like Moon, Mercury, Venus and Jupiter? Now coming to the planet Jupiter. Now what happens when Rahu is conjected with planet Jupiter? Now what does planet Jupiter represents? It represents teachers, advisors, counselors. It also represents your guiders. It also represents education, children. So when Rahu and Jupiter are conjected in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart, it shows that your spouse might be too selfish. It also shows that your spouse might be educated. Now, what happens when Rahu is conjected with planet Moon? Now, what does planet Moon represent? It represents your mind, your emotion. It also represents your mother. When Rahu and Moon are conjected in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart, it shows that after your married life, your mother's health might get affected. And it also shows that through your mother, you might get your spouse. And one thing you need to note on here is, while fighting with your spouse, you might get happiness because Moon signifies happiness. So, you might get happiness when you fight with your spouse. So, these are all things can be seen through when Rahu and Moon are conjected in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart. And one thing you need to note on here is you might get addicted towards alcohol, or your spouse might be addicted towards alcohol or cigars and all. So you need to be very careful here when Rahu and Moon are conjuncted in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart. Now, what happens when Rahu is conjuncted with planet Mercury? Now, what does planet Mercury represent? It represents your communication, business. It represents your logical ability. When Rahu and Mercury are conjuncted in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart, it shows that your marriage might become business. So, you need to make sure that the Rahu dispositor is placed very well. So, if it is placed very well, then nothing to worry. So, your communication become a main key factor in your marriage. And it also shows that you might marry someone who is business woman or who is an entrepreneur. So these are all things can be seen through when Rahu and Mercury are conjuncted in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart. And one thing you need to note down here is your spouse can be very practical. So you can note down, if it is in Pisces, then it may change. So woman can be spiritual woman also sometimes, or creative woman. Now, what happens when Rahu is conjuncted with planet Venus? Now, what does planet Venus represent? It represents love, romance, luxurious life. It also represents materialistic world. When Rahu and Venus are conjuncted in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart, it shows that you might get beautiful women, especially in particular nakshatras. So, if you want to know in which nakshatra the Venus is placed and what all the result you will get, so you have to take Navamsa course that I am going to start from October 11th. Now, when Rahu and Venus are conjuncted in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart, it shows that your spouse might be obsessed with materialistic things or materialistic world, like money, like say for example getting big house, big car. So she might get obsessed with those materialistic world. And one thing you need to note on here is you might fight with your spouse, because when Venus and Rahu are conjuncted in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart, it is not very good placement. So you need to be very careful here. Now, what happens when Rahu is conjuncted with planet Sun? Now, what does planet Sun represent? It represents your ego. It represents your leadership qualities. It also represents dominating nature. So when Rahu and Sun are conjuncted in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart, it shows that after your married life, it shows that your spouse might want to dominate over you. And it also shows that your spouse might be having some ego. So through ego, you might quarrel with your spouse because Rahu and Sun are enemy towards each other. Now, what happens when Rahu is conjuncted with planet Mars? Now, what does planet Mars represent? It represents aggressive nature. It represents cruel planet. So, when Rahu and Mars are conjuncted in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart, it shows that after a married life, you might fight with your spouse because of some anger issues, short temper nature. So, your spouse might be having some short temper nature or aggressive nature. So you might fight because of that. Your spouse might not be having some patience. So these are all things can be seen through when Rahu and Mars are conjuncted in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart. Now, what happens when Rahu is conjuncted with planet Saturn? Now, what does planet Saturn represent? It represents long term. It represents hard working. Now, when Rahu and Saturn are conjuncted in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart, it shows that you might get a spouse who might love to have long term relationship. Or it also shows that you might get a spouse who might be workaholic or hardworking woman or hardworking men. And it also shows that you might get a spouse who might be very lazy. So these all things can be seen through when Rahu and Saturn are conjuncted in the 7th house of the D9 chart or Navamsa chart. So see, this is only about the just placements of planet in the 7th house. But in order to know deep results and all, you need to go to the nakshatra level also. So in order to know the nakshatra level, so you need to take the Navamsa course that I am going to start from October 11th. So yep, this is it for today guys. So this was my analysis about Rahu in the 7th house of D9 chart or Navamsa chart. If you are new to my channel, please subscribe below or else I'll see you in the next video. So if you want any consultancy, please to contact my given below WhatsApp number or else you can even mail me also. So until and unless, thank you, bye bye, love you, take care.